Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Gostola. I'm the co-host of the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast, and I'm joined by my co-host, Rania Kalik. Hey, Rania.
Hey, Kevin.
And we're very pleased to have as our guest for this week, Kari Lydersen, who is a Chicago-based reporter. She's an author and a journalism instructor, and she recently wrote the article for In These Times, a magazine from Chicago. It's called The Case for Nationalizing the Railroads. Workers say now is the time to do the impossible, and we welcome her to the show.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
And I should also add, as someone who's been doing this work for a long time on these issues, that you authored this book on Rahm Emanuel, Mayor 1%, and you also authored the book Revolt on Goose Island, which covered the Republic Doors, the Republic Windows and Doors workers who took over a factory here in Chicago. And people might be familiar with this story. I recall that it featured in Michael Moore's Capitalism, a Love Story. So maybe those who are in our national audience who listen to the show might remember some of that. But to get into this article, it's probably good to just begin very basically. We're talking about the idea that the government would have some management or control over the railroads, and we can get into that. But perhaps why don't you begin with what led you to, because you were interested in this topic before. It seems from reading your article you were following this before the major train derailment that happened with Norfolk Southern in Ohio. So there's been all this attention to what we can do since that disaster took place in East Palestine. But we have had this persistent problem. And, going back to the strike that Biden was able to help the railroad barons thwart last year, it's clear that this is something that has been percolating beneath the surface for a long time.
Yeah. Let me jump back even a little bit or a good bit further in time briefly. So, I mean, like a lot of people, I've always thought trains were really cool, but not knowing a lot about the behind the scenes issues. And I guess it was around 15 years or so ago as part of the Labor Notes, a big labor conference in Chicago. I met Railroad Workers United, which is this really totally amazing independent labor organization of members from the 12 different unions that represent railroad workers. And at the time, one of the things that was really interesting about it was that these 12 unions, really had very little unity between them, and were pretty pro-employer. And fast forward about 15 years, and Railroad Workers United had another of their biannual conferences this past summer at Labor Notes, and or as part of Labor Notes. And the atmosphere was so different because these 12 unions, or maybe not all 12, but generally there was growing really big consensus across the rail industry that the system was just absolutely broken, and because of working conditions and just the way it runs in general. And it wasn't only the workers. There were actually big hearings in April, federal hearings where shippers, the clients that ship stuff on the railroads, were also testifying about how absolutely broken the system is. So that was in the spring and summer. And then, come fall, and a strike almost happened. So as I think I actually lost track of your question a little bit at this point, but there's plenty to keep talking about on, how do you fix this system and make it something that actually treats workers fairly and actually works as, such a crucial and one of the probably the most environmentally friendly ways of just moving the freight, not to mention passengers, that we need to keep our society going.
I'm curious if, for those who aren't familiar, because it seems like it's such a specific issue. So if you're not following railroads, if you don't ever take a train, you don't really understand the importance of trains and why like the railways matter and the conditions matter. Um, I'm curious if you can explain like what, and this sounds really basic, but like why trains are so important in America. Like they move so much more stuff than we realize. Like most people just think, "Oh, I take the train to get to like from DC to New York or something. That's my only interaction with like a railroad." But it's so much more than that. So what is, before we even get into like workers conditions and things like that, can you just lay out for those who aren't so familiar with the train industry, like what is so important about the functionality of trains and railroads in America?
Yeah, that is a great question. And sorry, I just had to plug in.
No worries.
Um, yeah, I mean, it's such a good question. We're talking mostly in this case about the freight railroads, and I don't have the tonnage handy, but they move a massive amount of the goods that we rely on from, unfortunately, the coal that we still rely on for a lot of power to chemicals, gravel, building products, consumer products, medical products, just so much of, and that was the reason that Biden gave for averting the strike was that we're absolutely dependent on this system and we can't even have a day's interruption in it or things will go to hell with our economy and safety. So that does show how crucial trains are to our lives, and then they are the most environmentally friendly mode of transport in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. Trucks are the other main alternative, and trucks emit a lot more harmful pollutants, harmful both to public health and greenhouse gas emissions. So we should be moving even more freight by rail, and that's one of the arguments for nationalization is that the system actually could be more efficient and more functional if we had a sort of better centralized planning and strip the profit motive out of it. So yeah, they really are this, not only a really cool thing that people love to learn about and watch go by, but absolutely central to the functioning of our society.
And the profit margins, the extreme profit margins, I think it's something like 50% as far as a profit margin, which is highly extreme even by corporate America standards. And I apologize. I'm having a little bit of bugginess with the internet. So, um,
Your audio's
but
coming fine. Your audio's coming through great, so that's all that
Uh,
really
so we're
matters.
just gonna roll with it. It's life, and maybe it gets better. Who knows? So, but the profit margins are extreme, and perhaps you could address the monopoly aspect of these corporations. Maybe just make sure everyone knows who the four are, and then just illustrate how extreme it is the control that they have over the railroad tracks that are in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, that's the one of the really fascinating and problematic thing about this industry is the quasi monopoly that does exist, and we have all these laws against monopolies, and the things like electric utilities that you call them regulated monopolies, where they do have a monopoly, there's a lot of regulation where the government has a lot of oversight and the public has avenues for input to try to avoid the abuses that we know come with the monopoly. But the railroad industry was essentially deregulated in 1980 and does not have much. There's still some approvals they need for mergers and things like that, but operates just with a ton of impunity and autonomy, despite being a near monopoly. So the structure of the major freight railroads, the major companies have gobbled up the smaller companies over the years, and right now there's really four to six, depending how you describe it, freight railroad companies that are pretty much running the vast, nearly everything, the vast majority of freight. So, and two of them dominate the west, let's say two of them dominate the West Coast: United UP, United Pacific, and BNSF. And then that's west of the Mississippi, and then east of the Mississippi, it's almost all done by CSX and Norfolk Southern, which is the one that had the Ohio derailment. And then there's two Canadian railroads that also have a large amount of freight. But basically, these companies are, running the vast majority of the freight and also own the vast majority of the tracks. And any other smaller railroads that do operate, plus Amtrak, are reliant on these four major companies because they're running on their tracks and kind of at their mercy. So, they really do have this, not quite monopoly, but, close to de facto monopoly control of the industry, which of course allows them to set standards and prices, and determine who has access to the market, to rail shipping at what prices. So just a lot of control that, not just the workers, but people from all different segments of policy and society, say has become really problematic and just is not functioning well.
You know, now that we've kind of laid that out, I'm wondering if you can build on that and kind of break down what are the conditions that railroad workers have been dealing with. Um, under these various, I guess, I like that you called them, Kevin called them railroad barons. That's a good way to describe them. Yeah, what are the conditions that they're dealing with here?
Yeah, so I mean, the workers, a lot of them really love this job. It's a highly skilled job, and they just, love the industry. A lot of them, but they've been quitting at high rates, especially in the past few years because of the working conditions. And a lot of it comes down to this thing called precision scheduled railroading, which is a specific structure that the major companies are using, and really all in the service of turning out absolutely maximum profits and pleasing the investors, the Wall Street big investors that pretty much own and control the industry at this point. So to summarize a really complicated system, it pretty much comes down to the railroads wanting to have the workers at their beck and call pretty much around the clock, so they can, call workers out exactly when they need them and not be too worried that workers are going to turn down an assignment, and, just be ready to ship the freight that's profitable when it's profitable to do it. So one of the biggest, or two of the biggest complaints workers had that came up during the strike debates was that they often feel like they're on call literally all the time. And if they turn down a call to work, they get this. Actually, not all the railroads do this, but especially the Western ones do, and the kind of general sentiment pervades the industry. They get negative points on their record if they don't adhere to a call to work, and they can get disciplined and fired or terminated pretty quickly through accruing those points. So they really just don't have much life of their own because they have to be ready and willing to work pretty much all the time. And then going along with that, they don't really have paid sick days. So, they're being forced to work like restaurant workers and people in some other sectors when they're sick. And then the same things that the shippers are concerned about, the workers, they're definitely concerned about how this just doesn't really give them much of a life outside of the job. They absolutely, want that right to have their own life, but they're also just really concerned about the industry and what they describe as safety risks and just the deterioration of the industry they love, because of the other aspects of this precision scheduled railroading and the way that it's made things untenable for a lot of shippers. It's actually reduced the amount of freight being shipped on railroads is actually going down even as they get more profitable, because just the really high profit freight is being prioritized. So the workers, even things that aren't directly about working conditions, the workers are really upset about that. And then there's been for years, workers have been fighting off this move to have one-man trains, and also just trains are getting longer and longer, freight trains. So trains well over a mile long are usually run by 2 people, and if companies had their way, there would just be 1 person on a, huge, massively heavy train that's over a mile long, and you can kind of see what would be problematic about that. So, those are things that they just are constantly, have looming over them, and, they don't feel they have the power to, they have been through great organizing, a lot of it with Railroad Workers United. They have been able to fight off this push for one-man trains so far, but, they feel like that's a constant battle that they're always at risk of losing too. So they just really want a little bit more voice, or a lot more voice in, how the industries run, and the ability to keep it a sustainable and efficient industry, going into the future.
And I know this past week that ProPublica was one of the media organizations that helped break this story that there is a policy in place at Norfolk Southern to ignore safety alerts. And if those come through, there's certain ones that they can just flat out disregard. Um, we're getting some of the in some details on the internal investigation on what happened with the derailment in Ohio, and it does look like there were some workers who were doing the best to respond and were struggling with it. And so my question to you is, what you were hearing from workers about the way in which the owners and management disregard their safety concerns to such a degree that they just feel like they're not going to be taken care of, that like when they leave and go to work and punch in, that they fear that there could be some kind of a horrific injury that happens to them that day, or that they're working with these chemicals. Like, could they get some kind of a disease or cancer that they would be concerned about, that would make it so that they could no longer work and provide for their family. So I'm just wondering what kind of things you were hearing from workers as far as their fears, which in my mind really mirror and seem to sound like a lot of what we read maybe from Upton Sinclair back in the early 1900s, as he described what life was like to work for, just to use the term that I used previously, barons that were running the economy.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely, this scheduling thing especially, definitely takes a toll on people's health, and, not even being able to schedule doctor's visits because of this whole scheduling issue. That was one of the big demands during the negotiations, was just to get the ability to actually make a doctor's appointment, something we usually take for granted, railroad workers have a lot of trouble doing. So there's definitely health and mental health impacts of the scheduling situation. And yeah, I mean, workplace injuries, exposure to toxins and things, it may not be quite as bad as the jungle in that sense, but the slaughterhouses, the jungle that you mentioned. But definitely, I think a lot of physical risks. And really, what I think I was hearing from workers the most on that front. Oh, and then it's, there have been a lot of this Ohio derailment is by no means the only recent one. There's derailments and accidents where workers are hurt and killed on a much more frequent basis than we hear about. The Railroad Workers United tracks those and puts out alerts, and I'm on their email list, and it's all too often that you see a railroad worker is killed or there's a serious accident. And but then I think, maybe even more than that, it's kind of like nurses. I've gotten to cover the labor struggles of nurses, and their own health and well-being is really drastically affected by their genuine concern for their patients and for the public. In the railroad workers case, for the public, when the industry presents a safety risk to, people like the community in East Palatine, or the Lac Megantic disaster in Canada a decade or more ago, where a whole town was kind of destroyed, and horrible health effects. Uh, yeah, so we're, railroad workers are really just stressed and in, psychological pain and suffering and mental injury a lot of times because of their concern that, they're doing a job that could actually be dangerous for other people too, because they're not given the safety protections and the rigorous oversight that the industry, they know that's something where you have these gigantic machines carrying often toxic material through populated areas, and they're the only or one of two, maybe in the future, the only person responsible for moving that machine through, in some cases, big cities or towns. I mean, you can see how terrifying and draining that would be. So I think that's a big part of it for them too.
Yeah, I want to dig into that a bit more because we have obviously this horrible train derailment in Ohio that is basically like poisoned an entire community. Um, and then also, I was surprised to see, like in reports about that derailment, the number of train derailments that take place throughout the year are quite high. And you're talking about like, yeah, like toxic substances, being moved through populated areas. So how can you maybe like elaborate a bit on how these working conditions can contribute to catastrophic problems, and did like some of these cost cutting measures and obviously prioritizing profit over everything else, like every industry in America functions, contribute to that derailment in Ohio? Like, what are the stakes
Yeah.
here?
Yeah, I mean, these are like machines with a lot of mechanical moving parts and a lot of computerized parts, and they rely on in a lot of cases, automated system of signals just to avoid collisions and things like that. So, there's a lot that can go wrong, and it's, I guess, maybe amazing that more doesn't go wrong. That's probably a testament to how great the workers are too. But, in that kind of situation, it's like you want the absolute maximum that you can have in terms of safety protections and redundancy and, inspection protocols. And workers, I mean, the investigation will, I'm sure, show more in East Palestine. But I mean, workers have been saying for a long time, and it's really just sort of common sense, that if you're really taking every measure to maximize the bottom line, and if you're cutting staff to save money and just losing staff because of the working and scheduling conditions, that are causing workers to quit and industries to actually struggle to get workers in some cases. If you're doing that, like, of course, safety is going to suffer, and any given, accident will be fully investigated, and they find out the factors that caused it. And some may be directly traceable to these failings, and some may not. But it's really, seems like pretty basic common sense that when you're really striving for maximum profit and you're thin on staff, safety is going to suffer. And I've covered health and safety in coal mines a lot, and I mean, there's parallels in a lot of industries. I'm sure I definitely see a lot of parallels there, where it just seems, even if safety and maintenance protocols are followed on paper, workers in the industry just have countless examples and frustrations with, how its productivity and profit is, prioritized, and they're not able to do, or they're encouraged, they feel like they're encouraged not to do what it would really take to have the absolute safest workplace and conditions possible.
Now, having covered this, one of the things that I picked up in your story for In These Times was that the struggle for expanding healthcare to cover everyone in the country. People talk about pushing for Medicare for all. That it sounded like a lot of the railroad workers that you spoke to understood the need for nationalization if they were open to it, in the same way that they feel this urgency to radically change and transform the healthcare system, because the for-profit issues in the healthcare system are similar to the problems that we're discussing here with the railroad system. So why don't you maybe describe, because that could be a way to um, get people organized, if there was a way to link the two issues to see that these workers needed both of these as a priority.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think it kind of speaks to healthcare is an interesting, a good parallel because it speaks to just what's sort of a public necessity and you could in this case say even a public utility. And what role does the private sector have in that? So, if you think of a product like I don't know, TVs or something like we don't really need TVs to function and to survive. So if that's like a purely private, market where companies compete and they might screw over their customers or not, like it's not going to really hurt people. But something like healthcare or education or delivery of electricity or delivery of the goods that we have on the railroads, that's really like pretty necessary to our societies. So, it's in everyone's interest to have it running in the best way it can and providing equitable service in the best way it can and most environmental way. So, it just like there's obviously a lot of debate and coverage of privatization in education and healthcare and these other sectors and the problems that that often causes. And just on its face, if you're going to have a profit driven sector and you're going to divert funds from this sector to just basically give to people, to shareholders and highly paid executives, instead of putting that money back into making better healthcare or better education or better railroads. It just sort of seems like, pretty obvious that there's flaws with that model. Like, wouldn't everyone be better off if the revenue was going back into making the system better or more affordable as opposed to just going to profit to people who probably don't even need it? Um, so, yeah, and the other thing that, with the healthcare analogy that Ron Kamenko, who's the co-founder and general secretary of Railroad Workers United, he was, you can talk about reform. If you're talking about nationalization, like that's a pretty radical step, like the public taking some form of ownership of the railroads. Uh, so you could also talk about, sort of reform or increased regulation, increased oversight by the government without actually taking away this or chipping away at this private control. So Ron did make a really nice analogy to Obamacare, which, Obamacare, I think did a lot of good things, made healthcare more accessible for a lot of people. So, overall pretty good, but definitely still left tons of people in the lurch and has tons of flaws and was really difficult to pass and really didn't fundamentally address the problems that we have with the healthcare system. So all this effort went into passing Obamacare when we could have taken the bold step of just having a single payer universal healthcare system. So Ron was like making that analogy for the railroads. We could kind of reform and increase regulation on the structure, and that would be sort of like Obamacare and probably would make things better with the railroads. But, it would still be kind of a Band-Aid as opposed to really just taking the huge step of introducing public ownership that could really address a lot of these issues at the root and give the public and workers a bigger say in how the industries actually run as opposed to just kind of putting some more regulations on the books that might or might not really be enforced.
Yeah, I am like, I kind of want to ask you about something tangentially related, and that is, you mentioned before how trains are actually more environmentally friendly, right, than moving things by truck. And I think there's that actually like says so much in terms of what we invest in. Like America has such a car culture, right? We all get around by driving. Mostly we have like really not so great and kind of like decaying subway and metro systems. It's actually funny, like on a personal note, I got into a car accident a few days ago, and
Oh,
luckily
no.
everybody was okay, but it was really scary. And it's like the last few days, all I keep thinking is, man, like cars are kind of like dangerous. And there's so much space for like all these individuals driving around, like having their own problems, probably distracting them from how they're driving. Um, and it really makes you like look at like infrastructure and the way that it is so much safer and for both the environment and for people to actually move things by rail. But instead, we invest so much more in like car culture and in highways than we do in this other thing that would be like so much more efficient and better for us. And I'm just curious if you have anything to say about that. Because you were talking about the environmental issue, but there's also a safety issue here. I mean, we're also talking about lack of safety in the rail industry because of the way workers are treated and sort of cutting corners and putting profit first. But it's like, I don't know. I guess I'm just asking about the bigger picture of in terms of moving things around the country, whether it's people or freight. Like, why are we investing so much more in something that's so much less efficient and actually really unsafe on a number of different levels?
Yeah, no, that's such a great point, and, that's twofold because, trucks are big semi trucks are on the road and carrying a lot of goods and also making the roads a lot less safe for drivers and emitting tons of pollution. So a lot of that freight on trucks could actually be moved to railroads if the railroad system was working better. And then, like you said, for passengers, the part we haven't really talked about, but Amtrak, is the passenger rail and actually is essentially publicly owned. And Amtrak is actually really popular and does move a lot of people and provide an alternative to cars for a lot of people, but it's really underutilized. Largely because it does rely on those tracks that are owned by the freight railroads, and they pretty much tell Amtrak like when and where it can go. So it's really hard for Amtrak to be the best system it could be because it has a lot of delays and limits to its service because it's reliant on those privately owned tracks where the freight takes precedence. Um, so, Amtrak could be a lot better if you had a nationalized system or if you made other changes to just make Amtrak better, and then more people could be using that instead of cars, which, you would have the environmental and safety and traffic and other benefits. And the Biden administration is investing, I think it's 66 billion, like a big investment in Amtrak. So that's great. That's a good start, but it'll still be hamstrung by the structure, the quasi-monopoly structure we talked about with these tracks. So yeah, I mean the environmental, both for public health, which is like the diesel emissions and the greenhouse gas effects, public ownership and just a better run rail system would really be a good environmental and safety thing for a number of reasons. And then you also like can make the rail industry more environmental. You can electrify the locomotives in rail yards and a lot of the equipment in rail yards, and you can make the actual locomotives on the tracks more environmentally friendly. But that takes investment. So if you have these private companies that are so aggressively profit driven, they're probably not going to make those environmental investments unless they really have to. They're going to divert that money to profit instead of investing it back in the absolute top of the line environmental system. So, that would be another argument for removing the profit motive is making it increasing safety, like sort of on the roads and the tracks, and then also increasing safety and health for the whole planet by curbing that pollution.
So I have a little bit of a tangential issue that I want to bring up before we wrap. But first, just to put a button on this conversation here, particularly on the nationalization of railroads, it does seem to me like it's really important to emphasize that something happened in the last 6 months with what was the way that the Biden White House chose to handle the threat of a strike. And that if you listen to some of these voices, people you even interviewed speak, that they'll say they thought that Joe Biden would be on the side of workers. They're very disappointed to see that Joe Biden came down on the side of the barons who run these corporations. it seems like that maybe opens things up quite a bit for these labor union leaders, and their rank and file to support something more radical, as in actually doing something about the root cause of the problem, than voting another Democratic president, or trying to get some better bureaucrats into the secretary of the transportation department that can manage it, or who or whatever. We're gonna maybe there's some people we want to put in the labor department to try and help with the matter as well. So maybe as we end, can you speak to that opening where politics have, it seems, alienated a lot of these rank and file, leaving them to believe in something more significant, and pushing for something more fundamental in change.
Yeah, I think that's where even though the strike didn't actually happen, and was crushed, I think that is a really exciting thing about the developments of this past year in railroads. I'm sure plenty of railroad workers are Republicans and libertarians and, all across the spectrum. So they might have hated Biden already, but the really important thing is that they were, regardless of who was in the White House, they were willing to, and ready to actually take the major step of going on strike and working collectively, and voting against the deal that their own union leadership had actually negotiated with the companies and with the administration. So, it was really an example, and still continues to be an example, kind of like the windows and doors thing, factory, but on a much larger, I mean, different, but nationwide scale, where workers are really like actively addressing what's totally wrong with this, what's kind of like the epitome of, has been like the epitome of what's wrong with capitalism going back to the 1800s, robber barons. And there's been just this increasing unity among railroad workers in addressing that and making that clear to the general public, and saying that they're ready to really take steps to change things. And so that's yeah, that's pretty exciting. I mean, it's a um, pretty promising example of, just the continued and increasing relevance of collective organizing and labor organizing, and you know showing that the labor laws that are on the books, aren't necessarily sufficient, and people really need to fight for their own rights as workers, and the way that their labor rights are ingrained in the well-being of society as a whole. So it will be super interesting to just see how this, the railroad workers struggle goes forward.
And I'm also wondering, like, obviously, we're talking a lot about the issue of nationalizing the railroads and stuff. Can you break down exactly what that would mean and why it's so important? Like, it's easy to say it and it sounds good, but what exactly would that entail? And why would that be so beneficial for both workers, consumers, and the country as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, there's different ways it could play out. Like on the most basic level, nationalizing is, the government, or in a sense, the public owning an industry. So the probably main two models with railroads, the government, the public could own the entire industry, like the actual companies. Well, they wouldn't be companies necessarily in that case, or they'd be publicly owned companies, but the entities actually shipping the freight, and it's other companies shipping the freight, but the public would be essentially owning and running the trains as well as the tracks. So that would be huge. That would be full nationalization of the industry. And then a maybe more realistic and probably also really helpful way to do it would be the public owning the infrastructure. In other words, the tracks and the rail yards and the other infrastructure on the ground that the trains actually run on. And then, the trains themselves could still be these private companies. But if the public owned the infrastructure, the public would have a lot more control of, just how the industry as a whole operates, and the scheduling, and the equity. and ideally also the labor conditions. So, so much would be in the actual implementation and in the details. And there's nationalized, there's municipally owned and federally owned companies and entities already that don't necessarily operate well. I mentioned in the story the Tennessee Valley Authority is a publicly owned power company that is kind of terrible, has a terrible record in different ways, and so it's not necessarily like a solution to have public ownership, but the idea is that you would have public ownership with some form of democratic control, a real meaningful role for workers and representatives of the general public and actually making decisions and running the industry. And yeah, so and a lot of other countries do this, a lot of with rail specifically. A lot of other countries do have nationalized rail systems, either the whole system or the infrastructure is nationalized. So it's really not that outlandish at all of a proposal. And yeah, something that could have a lot of benefits, and again removing that profit motive, putting the money back into the workers and the actual infrastructure and maintenance and operations, and being able to make decisions about safety and environmental sustainability and other things that aren't driven by profit. Those decisions aren't driven by profit, but just by what's best for everyone.
I'm glad that Ronnie asked that question. So I'm gonna pull rank here, and since we're both Chicagoans, I'm gonna show off my stack of local election mail that I've been bombarded with here in the city for the last month that I've been collecting because I don't know, maybe I might do something with my city council member and tell people a little bit. I'm in Uptown, which won't mean anything to anybody but you, Carrie. But my question to you is, since we're the third largest city in the United States, we've got this election. You wrote about Mayor Rahm Emanuel. We've seen this total collapse of Lori Lightfoot, who was the successor to Mayor Rahm Emanuel. I'm inviting you, if you want to help write her epitaph, because it looks really horrible for her right now. And she was supposed to come in, change things around, give a break from Rahm Emanuel. But maybe there's something you want to say from the last 4 years covering labor in the city of Chicago to speak to what really went wrong and has been wrong in this city, because right now it looks like there's this really major progressive surge happening among voters in the city. Not to mention, it's worth telling people around the country that we've been seeing Democratic socialists elected to the city council in the city, and that's contributed. So maybe you want to say anything as we wrap up here about the city of Chicago, and we've got election madness here.
That's a great question, and you said it really well. Yeah, it's an interesting time, and I think it does, just as you said. What was really remarkable about Rahm Emanuel's tenure was, how the public and different organizations and labor organizations galvanized and organized, in opposition to him, and really just taking more control during his tenure. And, we didn't expect, or a lot of people didn't expect, that would be necessary during Lori Lightfoot's tenure. And I was actually really excited when she won, but it has turned out that, and I think a lot of people were saying this from day one with Lori Lightfoot, but I think it makes sense in retrospect that she never really had a background in any kind of popular movement or labor movement, or she was saying progressive things, but she didn't really have any grounding or experience in working with and for the people, and like that soon became clear with a lot of problems very similar to Rahm Emanuel's problems with being autocratic and corporate driven. So yeah, but this election is messy, and it's hard to say exactly what's going to happen. But I think that, as you said, the increasing independent political power and power of popular and grassroots and labor stakeholders in the city has only continued to grow and get more diverse and interesting. So it is a pretty cool and fascinating time in Chicago, as always in Chicago.
And I just want to tell you that it's nauseating, Rania, because we get like 10 candidates to choose from, and no matter what, we're all expected to come back later on for a runoff because none of
Mm,
these candidates are going to get 50%. So the city is going to waste money on another election, and we don't have we need ranked choice voting. We need some kind of a system here in the city so that we don't have to do this. I don't know what New York does or LA or these other cities, but this happened with Lori back 4 years ago. This happened when Rahm decided not to run, that you had like a dozen or so candidates, and Lori basically made it into the runoff with uh like 16 or 15% of the vote. That was like how she became this person. So that's another problem. You've got candidates being catapulted into a position to be mayor who only have like, you know, 2 or 3% of Chicago's population as their supporters. They're not
mm.
majority candidates by any means, who then get forced on us. So, but that's enough of Chicago politics. My internet is really bad. And so we need to wind down this interview. But to the best of my ability, I'm going to say thank you to Kari for being on the show. It was good to talk to you. This is excellent work. I'm glad we could talk to you about your story in these times magazine.
Oh, thank you so much, Kevin and Rania. It's great to see you, and I'm glad you're still in Chicago and doing this work, Kevin. And yeah, it was really fun to talk. Thank you.